Chapter 1, The Terrifying Scream. This year's Tet Festival was livelier and more crowded than before. People flocked to the temple to pray for blessings and peace. Over the past 3 years, the COVID-19 pandemic has ravaged the entire world in general and Vietnam in particular, causing tens of millions of deaths and countless hardships. People everywhere suffered immense grief, many families lost their loved ones to the disease, and the economy plummeted drastically for humanity across the globe. These past 3 years have felt like literal hell on earth. This year, an ancient and sacred temple in Taiwan welcomed an overwhelming number of visitors and pilgrims. The place buzzed with the sounds of people coming and going. Worshippers were sincerely praying for peace, good fortune, and smooth success in their work when suddenly a piercing scream echoed through the air, startling everyone. Accompanying the scream were furious curses resounding from the temple's main hall. "Ah! My head hurts so much. You bald monks! Let me go now? If not, I will make sure your entire family is torn apart. I curse all of you. Your businesses will fail. Your descendants will fall ill, be imprisoned, and never be able to lift their heads. I curse you all." Ah! The words sent chills down the spines of the visitors and worshippers, terrifying them. Some brave individuals peeked into the main hall to see who was screaming and cursing so wildly, daring to defile such a sacred and revered place. But the moment they looked inside, their faces turned pale, and their mouths gaped open in shock, unable to utter a word. Seated in the middle of the hall was a young man, estimated to be around 18 or 19 years old, screaming and cursing frantically. His body was emaciated, and as he writhed and thrashed, it became clear that he was tightly bound with ropes and red threads. Beside him, 2 young monks held him down firmly. Around the hall, other monks and the head abbot were chanting Buddhist scriptures, striking wooden prayer blocks in rhythmic unison. Chapter 2, The Family's Past. The story began 6 years ago. Nam, now 12 years old, was a diligent and academically gifted 7th grade student at An Phu Secondary School, located in An Phu Ward, District 2, Ho Chi Minh City. Nam's parents were both lawyers, making their family quite well off in the area. Nam had an older sister named Lan, who was 17 years old. However, from a young age, Lan had been diagnosed by doctors with brain atrophy and memory impairment, along with fragile health. Despite undergoing numerous medical treatments, her condition showed no improvement. Because of this, their parents decided to keep Lan at home, hiring a caretaker and a housemaid to look after her so they could focus on work. After 5 years of waiting and hard work, Hung and his wife were blessed with a son, whom they named Nam. As Nam grew up, he became an obedient and intelligent child, excelling in his studies, which made his parents place high hopes in him. As for Lan, whenever their parents were at work and Nam was at school, she was always under the watchful care of the housemaid. Their parents strictly instructed the maid never to let Lan go outside alone for fear that she might get lost. Understanding this, Lan never ventured out, as she did not want to cause her parents any worry. Chapter 3, Visiting Maternal Grandparents' Hometown. This summer, Nam and his sister were taken by their parents to visit their maternal grandparents, which made them both extremely excited. Since Nam's school had granted students an extended summer break of over a month, he decided to stay at his grandparents' house for a full month, taking the opportunity to have fun with his childhood friends in the countryside. Bim bim. The sound of a car horn echoed in front of a yellow iron gate. Behind the gate stood a 3-story white house with a spacious garden filled with trees and flowers. Hearing the familiar horn, an elderly man, around 75 or 76 years old, with a mix of black and grey hair, stepped out of the house. He wore a cheerful smile, though the wrinkles on his face revealed the traces of time and old age. The old man slowly walked to the gate, unlatched it, and called out loudly, "You're home, my children." In front of the house, a white Toyota 7-seater was parked at the gate. Standing beside the car were Hung and Thursday, along with their 2 beloved children. Seeing Mr. Hai, Hung and Thursday greeted him, while Lan and Nam waved excitedly, overjoyed to see his daughter's family. Mr. Hai opened the gate while calling into the house, "Dear, Thursday and her family are here." Hearing her husband's voice from the kitchen, Mrs. Nyok, who was cooking, immediately stopped what she was doing and rushed out to greet them. As soon as she reached the gate, she embraced her 2 grandchildren tightly, exclaiming, "You must stay longer this summer. We've missed you both so much. Every year, you only visit for 5 or 6 days before heading back to Saigon." Hung replied with a smile, "Yes, Mom. This year, I'll only stay for 3 days because work and household matters keep us busy. But we're leaving the kids in your care for the summer. Nam's school gave him over a month off, and he insisted on staying here for the full month to enjoy the fresh air and be with you both." Hearing this, Mr. Hai nodded happily and said, "That's wonderful. We'll have more time to be close to our beloved grandchildren." After the conversation, Hung drove the Toyota into the yard, while Thursday, the 2 kids, and Mr. Hai went inside the house. Meanwhile, Mrs. Nyok returned to the kitchen to finish cooking. In the past, Mr. Hai had been a lawyer, while Mrs. Nyok ran a clothing business. Through years of hard work and savings, they had managed to provide Thursday with a good education and later built their retirement home in the countryside. The whole family gathered around the dining table, enjoying a warm and happy meal together. After dinner, Thursday helped Mrs. Nyok wash the dishes, while Mr. Hai and Hung sat in the living room chatting. Lan, feeling slightly exhausted from the long journey, went upstairs to rest. As for Nam, he darted outside, eager to reunite with his childhood friends in the village. He couldn't wait to play games like kite flying, marble shooting, and hide and seek with them. Chapter 4, The Abandoned Shrine Beneath the Banyan Tree. Time passed quickly, and today marked Nam's 5th day in the countryside. His parents had already returned to Saigon for work, leaving everything peaceful and joyful, until that fateful day. 2 weeks had passed since Nam's summer vacation in the village. That morning, his close friends invited him to play near the ancient banyan tree at the village center. Speaking of this banyan tree, it had existed for an incredibly long time, long before the village was even built. The villagers deeply respected and worshipped the ancient tree. It was massive, providing shade for farmers resting after long hours in the fields, and serving as a playground for children who often played hide and seek and tag around its thick roots. That day, Nam and his friends were playing marbles near the tree. About 20 minutes into the game, Nam accidentally shot a marble too hard, sending it deep into the banyan's tangled roots. determined to retrieve his marble. Nam began searching around the tree's base while his friends looked nearby. After a few minutes of searching with no luck, Nam was growing frustrated. Just as he was about to give up, his eyes locked onto a small stone slab partially hidden beneath thick, overgrown grass and wild plants. A sudden thought flashed through his mind: could my marble have rolled into there? Driven by curiosity, he stepped closer to the stone slab, holding a small stick in one hand to push aside the thick weeds while using his other hand to pull out stray grass. As he cleared away the overgrowth, he realized something strange. This wasn't just an ordinary rock. It resembled a small shrine. But he wasn't too concerned. All that mattered to him was finding his marble. And there it was, sitting neatly inside the tiny shrine. Since the weeds were still thick, Nam called 2 of his friends over to help clear the area. It took them a solid 10 to 15 minutes to remove all the wild plants around the shrine's entrance. While pulling out weeds, Nam accidentally tore a yellow paper charm that had been stuck to the shrine's door. It had strange red symbols scrawled across it, symbols he didn't understand. But he paid no attention to it. To him, finding his marble and playing with his friends was far more important. Now that the weeds were cleared, Nam reached inside the shrine to grab his marble. The moment his fingers touched it, an icy chill ran down the back of his neck. His vision blurred, and within seconds, everything went dark. Nam collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Chapter 5, Waking Up. When Nam regained consciousness, he found himself lying in his grandparents' bedroom. He had no idea how he ended up there. His last memory was playing marbles with his friends near the ancient banyan tree in the middle of the village. He vaguely recalled searching for his lost marble inside a small shrine. As his thoughts swirled in confusion, the door suddenly creaked open. His grandmother, Mrs. Nyok, stepped inside, holding a steaming bowl of porridge in her hands. She placed the bowl on the bedside table and said, "You're awake? How are you feeling? Let me check." She gently placed her hand on his forehead to see if he had a fever. After a moment, she sighed in relief. "Thank goodness. You're fine." Nam sat up and rubbed his temples before speaking. "I'm okay, Grandma. I feel much better now." "But, Grandma, I remember playing marbles near the banyan tree with my friends. How did I end up back home?" Mrs. Nyok gave him a concerned look and replied, "You don't remember anything?" Nam furrowed his brows. "I only remember reaching for my marble inside that small shrine. And then suddenly, everything went black. When I woke up, I was here." His grandmother handed him the bowl of porridge and said, "Eat this while I tell you what happened." Nam obediently took a few spoonfuls. And once he had eaten about half the bowl, his grandmother began recounting the events. "That morning, I was in the kitchen preparing lunch, and your grandfather was playing chess with Mr. Kong, our neighbor, in the living room. Suddenly, we heard Tuan, Mr. Kong's grandson, shouting from outside the gate. I rushed out and saw him standing there, out of breath, saying, 'Grandma?' Nam passed out under the banyan tree in the village. Your grandfather and Mr. Kong immediately stopped their game and ran outside. We were about to rush to the tree when we saw Uncle Lin, the village head, carrying you on his back, heading toward our house. Your grandfather asked what had happened, and Uncle Lin explained that he had been on his way to the rice fields when he noticed a group of kids huddled together around something. When he got closer, Tuan called him over to help bring you back home. Meanwhile, Tuan himself ran ahead to inform us. Honestly? Naam. What were you all thinking? It was scorching hot outside. And you all decided to play marbles in the sun. No wonder you fainted. Your friends got a good spanking from their parents for being reckless. Running around in the heat like that, what a bunch of troublemakers. Naam couldn't help but chuckle at the thought of his friends getting punished. At the same time, he felt a little sorry for them. As for the small shrine, his grandmother shook her head. I don't know much about it. But your grandfather told me that when he was young, the village elders said it was an abandoned shrine that had existed for countless years. No one knows who built it or for what purpose. But the elders always warned that it should never be disturbed. Naam listened carefully while finishing his porridge. After eating, he still felt weak. So he went back to bed to rest. However, deep inside, an unsettling feeling lingered. What exactly had happened at that shrine? Chapter 6, The Terrifying Dream. That night, as Naam slept, he had a strange and terrifying dream. In his dream, he found himself sitting under the ancient banyan tree, facing the small shrine. His hands were busy pulling out the overgrown weeds around it to clear the area. Once the space was cleared, he reached inside to retrieve his lost marble. The moment his fingers grasped it, something cold and hairy shot up from the ground. A leg covered in thick white fur grabbed his wrist. Startled, Naam yanked his hand back and stumbled several meters away. His heart pounded as he watched in terror. Slowly, the rest of the creature emerged from the shrine, first its sharp, pointed ears, then its elongated snout. After a moment, a large, fully formed body covered in snowy white fur crawled out. Naam wanted to run, but his body felt frozen, as if turned to stone. His wide eyes were glued to the strange figure before him. The creature leapt onto the top of the shrine and sat there, casually licking its front paws. It was then that Naam finally got a clear look. It was a fox. A magnificent white fox. It sat on the shrine's roof, licking its paw while staring at him with icy blue eyes. Naam's mind swirled with emotions: shock, fear, fascination, and disbelief. He had never seen a fox up close before, let alone one this large. It was the size of a full-grown German shepherd, with thick, pristine white fur and 3 long, elegant tails swaying gently behind it. Then, a voice suddenly echoed inside Naam's mind. "Thank you for setting me free." Naam gasped and yelled, "Who's there? Who just spoke?" The voice replied, "It's me. Right in front of you." Naam's breath hitched as he looked at the fox. The creature flicked its tails and continued licking its paws as if the whole situation was nothing out of the ordinary. Shaking, Naam raised a trembling finger and pointed at the fox. You can talk." The fox's blue eyes gleamed with amusement. Then, it opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth, and spoke in a raspy, low voice. "Yes, I can." For a moment, it simply stared at Naam, as if studying him. Then, its eyes flashed brightly. Its 3 tails twitched, and it let out a low chuckle. Suddenly, the fox's grin widened, and it bared its fangs. "You belong to me?" Before Naam could react, the fox lunged straight at him. "Get away from me!" Naam screamed. The next thing he knew, he was wide awake, drenched in sweat, He frantically looked around, realizing he was still in his bedroom. It was just a dream. But it felt so real. Down in the garden, Mr. High and Mrs. Nyok were watering the vegetables when they heard Nam's terrified scream. Alarmed, they rushed upstairs. Lam, who had been playing in the living room, also ran up to check on her younger brother. A moment later, Nam saw his grandparents and sister standing at the doorway. Mrs. Nyok frowned. "Why are you screaming in broad daylight, child?" Nam waved his hand dismissively, trying to shake off the lingering fear. "It's nothing, Grandma. I just had a bad dream." Still feeling unsettled, he got out of bed and walked to his desk. He pulled open the drawer and grabbed the Samsung phone his mother had left for him. Without another word, he hurried downstairs to the living room, turning on his phone to distract himself with games. But no matter how hard he tried, the image of the three-tailed fox with glowing blue eyes wouldn't leave his mind. Chapter 7, The Lingering Fever. After dinner, Nam went straight back to his room, lying on his bed and scrolling through his phone. Meanwhile, Lan stayed behind to help Mrs. Nyok wash the dishes. Mr. High was watching the evening news on TV when suddenly, a piercing howl echoed from the third floor. The eerie sound sent chills down Mr. High's spine. Alarmed, he and Mrs. Nyok immediately rushed upstairs to check on Nam. As soon as Mr. High pushed open the door, he was met with a terrifying sight. Nam was sprawled out on the floor, unconscious, his eyes tightly shut. Mrs. Nyok gasped in horror and ran to cradle Nam in her arms. Tears welled up in her eyes as she cried, "My child? What's wrong with you?" Mr. High quickly pulled her away and lifted Nam onto the bed. He placed a hand on Nam's forehead and frowned. It was burning hot. That night, Mr. High and Mrs. Nyok stayed awake, watching over their grandson without a moment of rest. Lam, unaware of what had happened, had already gone to sleep in her room on the second floor. Worried, Mr. High called Thursday and Hung, asking if they should take Nam to the hospital. However, Thursday reassured him over the phone, saying, "Dad, Nam's fever is 38.5 degrees Celsius, it's not too serious. Just give him medicine and electrolyte drinks, and he should recover soon." But Nam's fever persisted for 2 whole days, making his grandparents increasingly anxious. What frightened them even more was that, during his sleep, Nam kept muttering in a distressed voice, "Get away. Stay away from me." Hearing those words sent shivers down Mr. High and Mrs. Nyok's spines. They loved their grandson dearly. He was their most treasured child. If anything were to happen to him, they wouldn't know how to bear it. Thankfully, by the morning of the 3rd day, Nam's fever finally broke, and he slowly returned to normal. Chapter 8, A Drastic Change. Ever since Nam woke up from his fever, Mr. High and Mrs. Nyok couldn't shake the feeling that their grandson had become a completely different person. It had now been 6 days since Nam recovered, yet his personality had changed drastically. He was no longer the gentle, obedient boy they once knew. Instead, he had become short-tempered, easily irritated, and quick to anger. Most disturbingly, Nam had developed an aggressive streak. He seemed to enjoy fighting. Every day, villagers would see him brawling with other kids in the village. Some ended up with bruises, while others left with bloody noses and busted lips. When Mr. High and Mrs. Nyok told him to apologize, Nam refused outright. Instead, he coldly stated. They deserved it for always teasing me. Even his closest friends, Tuan and the others, grew wary of him. After seeing how Nam mercilessly beat up the village kids who had once teased them, they started keeping their distance. From that day forward, Nam was known as the toughest kid in the village, the one no one dared to provoke. But that wasn't the only strange thing about him. Nam had also developed a peculiar craving for chicken, especially rooster meat. Mr. Hai remembered vividly, when Nam first woke up from his fever. The very first thing he said was, "I'm starving. I want chicken porridge." That statement alone had shocked his grandparents. They knew their grandson well, ever since he was little. Nam had hated eating chicken. In fact, he was allergic to it. Whenever he ate chicken, his skin would break out in itchy rashes. When Mr. Hai questioned him about it, Nam simply replied, "Maybe my body changed after this illness. Besides, I haven't eaten chicken in a long time, so I just want to try it again." Although they found it odd, Mr. Hai and Mrs. Nyok didn't dwell on it for too long. Thinking it was just a phase, Mrs. Nyok went out and bought him a steaming bowl of chicken porridge. From that day on, every 3 to 4 days, Nam demanded chicken, especially rooster meat. 2 days later, Hung and Thursday returned to the village to take Nam and Lan back to Saigon. Since school was starting soon, they wanted Nam to get a head start on his studies before the semester began. However, as they packed up to leave, neither Hung nor Thursday noticed the unsettling look in Mr. Hai and Mrs. Nyok's eyes, an unspoken worry that something about Nam was deeply, unnaturally wrong. Chapter 9, Strange Occurrences. Ever since returning from the countryside, Nam had become noticeably lazy when it came to studying. His parents, Hung and Thursday, constantly reminded him to focus, but their words seemed to go in one ear and out the other. After countless attempts to discipline him with no success, they eventually gave up. They assumed Nam was simply upset about having to leave the countryside earlier than he wanted. But things only got stranger. Late at night, whenever Hung or Thursday passed by Nam's bedroom, they often heard him talking to himself. When they asked him about it the next day, he would always brush it off, saying, "Nothing happened." However, Nam's behavior continued to change in unsettling ways. At school, his academic performance plummeted. He stopped paying attention in class, refused to do his homework, and frequently got into fights with other students. Despite repeated scoldings and warnings from his teachers, Nam remained the same, rebellious, aggressive, and completely uninterested in studying. At home, his temperament was even more erratic. He was often irritable, snapping at his family for no reason. Sometimes, he would sit in a dark corner, muttering to himself as if having a conversation with someone unseen. On multiple occasions, Hung and Thursday distinctly heard Nam talking to someone in his room late at night. But whenever they opened the door, they found him alone, staring at his phone. The more time passed, the more uneasy they felt. Something was undeniably wrong with their son, but they had no idea what it was. Chapter 10, The Criticism. Time flew by, and it had now been a month since Nam returned to school. That evening, after dinner, Hung and Thursday once again went up to Nam's room. For the past month, they had been constantly summoned to school. Every few days, Nam's homeroom teacher would call them to the principal's office because he had gotten into fights with his classmates. It wasn't just the school, Even the neighbors had lost patience with Naam's behavior. People in the neighborhood openly criticized Hung and Thursday, blaming them for failing to raise their son properly. That night, after work, Hung and Thursday decided it was time to confront Naam. When they opened the door to his room, they were met with a strange sight. Naam was sitting cross-legged on his bed, his face turned toward the wall, his back facing the door. Hung and Thursday had never seen him like this before. Fueled by anger, Hung stormed into the room and slammed a stack of papers onto the desk with a loud bang. At the top of the pile was a self-reflection letter, Ban Kiem DM, along with various complaints and criticism letters from parents whose children had been beaten by Naam. Hung's voice thundered through the room. Is this how you think school should be? Naam, you don't pay attention in class. And you keep fighting with your classmates. Do you even realize how many complaints we've received from the school and other parents? Do you know how ashamed we are because of you? Thursday added furiously. What the hell is wrong with you? Naam, how did you become like this? Meanwhile, Lan was playing downstairs. Upon hearing the shouting, she didn't even react. She had grown used to her parents scolding Naam nearly every night for the past month. But something felt off. Tonight, Naam wasn't talking back. He wasn't making excuses. He just sat there, his back still turned to them, unmoving. Chapter 11, The Terrifying Discovery. Despite his parents' furious yelling, Naam remained completely still. His silence only fueled Hung and Thursday's anger even more. Then, after a long pause, Naam finally spoke, his voice eerily calm and devoid of emotion. Have you two finished talking yet? His indifferent tone sent a chill down their spines. Thursday's face twisted in fury. Watch your mouth, you brat. Is that how you speak to your parents? Just as she finished speaking, Naam's head suddenly snapped around unnaturally fast. His cold, icy blue eyes locked onto them, radiating a chilling malice. His expression was void of warmth, his gaze sharp and predatory. The room instantly felt colder. Then, in a raspy, deep voice that sounded nothing like Naam, he repeated, I said, have you two finished talking yet? Hung and Thursday froze in horror. This wasn't their son. Hung's mind raced. He suddenly recalled what his parents, Mr. Hai and Mrs. Nyok, had told him when he came to take Naam back to Saigon. They had mentioned Naam passing out in front of the abandoned shrine beneath the banyan tree. They had warned him about the strange changes in Naam's behavior after his illness. Hung quickly pieced everything together, the unexplained fever, the sudden aggression, the eerie late-night whispers, and his unnatural craving for chicken, especially rooster meat. His expression darkened. His hand clenched into a fist. He pointed directly at Naam and shouted, who the hell are you? Where is our real son? Thursday's breath hitched. She turned to her husband in shock, her face draining of color. Hung, what are you saying? But before Hung could answer, Naam suddenly burst into laughter, a wild, manic, and inhuman laugh. His laughter echoed through the room, filled with pure, unhinged madness. Then, in the same chilling voice, he spoke again. Playing hide and seek was fun, but I think it's time to end the game. You should have figured it out much sooner. Your precious little son hasn't been yours for a long time. Chapter 12, The Three-Tailed Demon Fox, and Its Devious Words. The entity inhabiting Naam's body smirked and began to speak in a voice dripping with arrogance. I am a three-tailed demon fox, known as Tam Vayu Ho. I spent over 800 years cultivating atop the mountains in ancient times. But then, a powerful monk destroyed me, burning my physical body to ashes. My soul was sealed beneath that small shrine. Hearing this, Hung immediately deduced that this fox spirit was male. Meanwhile, Thursday stood frozen, deep in thought, as if trying to process everything. After a moment of regaining his composure, Hung scoffed. "Well, you must have done a lot of evil to deserve such a fate. You were punished accordingly." The fox spirit's expression darkened instantly. Bang! Naam's body slammed a fist onto the bed, his teeth grinding in fury. His blue eyes burned with malice as he snarled. "Shut your mouth, you ignorant brat. You think you have the right to lecture me?" Hung clenched his fists but remained calm. "What do you want?" The fox spirit suddenly grinned, its expression shifting from rage to eerie amusement. It spoke smoothly, its tone dripping with cunning. "You and your wife carry heavy karmic burdens. But I am a generous being. If you obey me, I will bless you with boundless wealth and prosperity. Every 3 to 4 days, simply prepare a ritual offering, a grand fruit platter filled with medicinal herbs and a boiled rooster for me to feast upon. Do this, and your business will flourish beyond your wildest dreams." The moment money was mentioned, Thursday's hesitant thoughts wavered. She had been deep in contemplation. But now, she couldn't help but ask, "And if we refuse?" The fox spirit suddenly threw its head back and laughed, a chilling, maniacal sound that sent shivers down their spines. Then, its glowing blue eyes gleamed with pure malice. It locked its gaze onto Thursday, its voice now laced with a sinister threat. "Then I will tear your family apart. I will ensure you live in misery, where even your livestock won't rest in peace." Hung and Thursday instinctively took several steps back, their faces paling in fear. The fox spirit continued smoothly, its tone eerily composed. "But you need not worry. As long as you follow my instructions, everything will remain peaceful. I will keep this secret between us, your precious son. I have no intention of harming him. He was the one who set me free. He is my fated vessel." Hung's fists tightened. "Then why did you possess him, Naam, or rather?" The fox spirit grinned wider. "Because he is compatible with me. His destiny aligns with mine. That is why I chose him." The demon fox's voice deepened, carrying an undeniable finality. "Now that you know who I am, we can have a more civilized conversation moving forward. During the day, he will remain your son. But at night, he will be me." Then, as if dismissing them entirely, the fox spirit waved a hand lazily. "Now, you may leave. Do not interrupt my cultivation." As Hung and Thursday turned to leave, the fox spirit's voice lowered into a dangerous warning. "And remember, don't try anything foolish. Don't even think about summoning a priest, or an exorcist. If I find out," Naam's lips curled into a sinister smile, "I will not be so merciful." Hung and Thursday left the room in silent despair. Their faces were etched with deep worry, helplessness, and fear. Their son, their beloved Naam, was no longer just a boy. He was now something else entirely.